This next story is going to show you why politics will put me in an early grave. It makes my blood pressure skyrocket. One of these days I'm going to have an aneurysm or a massive heart attack. So, look, we're playing this cat and mouse game. We've been from the beginning of Biden's time in office of, like, how do we get Joe Manchin? How do we coax Joe Manchin and lightly prod him in the right direction so he does the right thing? That was never the approach. It was never going to work. You always had to make him do the things that you want him to do. Make him use political pressure, use the carrot or stick approach, be a mafia boss. That's the only way you're going to get stuff done for the American people. In the name of democracy, make his punk ass fall in line. Well, that's not the case. So now let me go ahead and show you this tweet from Jeff Stein and show you what we're on to now. New White House aides discussing pivoting Biden economic agenda to center deficit reduction with taxes on the rich and corporations in bid to woo Manchin and secure approval of the climate planks. Your skepticism is warranted. Indeed, Jeff Stein, indeed it is. So there's a number of things to say about this. First of all, the wisdom of deficit reduction at a time like right now. Anyway, it is not wise. It is not wise. The economy is effectively built on a house of cards, and if you do deficit reduction, you are definitionally doing austerity politics, and austerity politics will hurt the working class. There's this misnomer that is incredibly pervasive that's still out there in the American psyche, and Republicans have really played this up for decades now. This idea that deficits are just bad, like you don't want to run a deficit ever, and this idea that the federal government needs to run like a personal household. That is not true. When you have a personal household, you don't have your own sovereign currency. So yeah, you have to balance your budget. The federal government does not. Not only do we have a sovereign currency, we have the world reserve currency. Every developed country has a national debt and oftentimes runs a deficit. Now, sometimes, you can not run a deficit and you can be sort of neutral on that front, but you're never going to eliminate the national debt. And oftentimes you want to run a deficit. That's just good economics because public debt yields private growth. That's the general rule. This is what we know from Keynesian economics. This is what we know from MMT, modern monetary theory. So to center that is just not, it's not a good idea. That's just not a good idea. But okay, so he centers that. Now, the goal of centering that, he says, well, we got to get Joe Manchin somehow. So this is how we get Joe Manchin. We do deficit reduction. He says he cares about deficit reduction. We'll do deficit reduction. He doesn't actually care about deficit reduction. This is his dodge anytime people are like, why don't you want to do elder care? Why don't you want to do universal pre-K? Why don't you want to cut prescription drug prices? Why don't you want to do the extended child tax credit? His dodge is to say, oh, I'm so worried about the deficit. How do we know this is BS from Joe Manchin? He just voted for the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which has a lot of corporate giveaways in it, by the way. He just voted for that, which adds over $200 billion to the deficit. So his concern is not the deficit. If he actually cared about the deficit, he would have said, sorry, I can't do it because the infrastructure bill is going to add to the deficit. That's not his concern. It's his dodge. He is lying that he cares about that. But Biden takes it as a good faith claim. He's like, okay, we'll do that. But then notice, he's like, well, how are we going to do it? Well, this part is good. Raise taxes on the rich and corporations. That's how we're going to do deficit reduction. Joe Manchin has a principled stance against raising taxes on the wealthy. How do you not get it at this point? Maybe he could stomach a percentage point or two in the top marginal tax rate, but anything he said about like, oh no, I am for raising tax on the rich, he's lying. He's trying to protect his ass because ultimately he never ends up voting for any of the tax increases on the rich. How many provisions about rich tax increases were slapped down by the likes of Manchin and Sinema? And what they would do is this game where if one of them said they were for tax increases on a certain wealthy group or corporations, the other one would say, I don't want that one. And they would alternate back and forth between, I don't want that one, then I don't want that one. And would you look at that at the end of the day? We're not getting any tax increases on the rich because between the two of them, they're not in favor of any of them together. It was a plan. It was a plot. This is a dodge. Why doesn't Joe Manchin want to raise taxes on the rich and corporations? Because those are his donors. Those are the people he's really representing. I mean, we covered the More Perfect Union video that came out not too long ago. They went into detail about he took X amount of money from this group and X amount of money from that group and X amount of money from this Trump Republican donor and X amount of money from that Trump Republican donor. He is representing those interests. He's not representing the people of West Virginia. I know he likes to do this dodge. I'm a West Virginia Democrat. All of the polls coming out of West Virginia show Build Back Better was incredibly popular, and the individual provisions are even more popular. Every single one. So when he says, I'm a West Virginia Democrat, that's a lie, because if he was, he would have voted for Build Back Better. No questions asked. No pushback. No axe this provision and that provision. None of that. So he's doing, like, what is it, Joe Biden? What is it? Are you just a sucker? And you fall for his head fakes and you fall for his posturing? Is that what it is? Or are you in on the game? I honestly, I think Joe Biden's just a sucker. I think he really thinks, well, if I center deficit reduction and do that with tax increases on the rich and corporations, maybe I'll get Manchin. No, you won't. For the love of God. It's been a while now since basically Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Joe Biden were like, here, Joe Manchin, here's a pen. Write down what you want to pass and we'll pass it. And guess what? He hasn't given a proposal. Why? Because he's not in favor of anything. It's going to put me in an early grave, man. It's going to put me in an early grave. This guy's playing patty cakes with Joe Manchin. He's slapping his back and calling him JoJo. And the entire time Joe Manchin is laughing at him. And Joe Manchin is serving his donors. And we're getting Dickie McGee's axe at the end of the day. Bupkis. Nothing. It's going to fail. This is going to fail. Obviously, it's going to fail. And I'm not even sure it's a good thing because you don't really want to do the deficit reduction right now. I want to raise tax on the rich and corporations, but I don't want to do deficit reduction right now. That's not a good idea with the way the economy is. Joe Biden, if he wants to save face and not have the biggest blowout in midterm election history for the U.S., he would immediately break out that executive order pen, immediately eliminate all student loan debt, immediately legalize marijuana by taking it off the scheduled substances list, immediately invoke the Defense Production Act to increase COVID therapeutic treatment. I mean, I can go on and on here. David Dane of the American Prospect wrote a phenomenal article saying all the things Joe Biden could do just through executive order. He technically has the authority to do Medicare for all for the entire country because we have a health emergency in the country right now, pandemic. He can say, I'm going to use my emergency powers to pay everybody's bills for their health care. He's got to do stuff like this if he wants to just not get obliterated in the midterms. And he's not. He's not going to do any of it. Incredibly weak, pathetic president. And at this point, it's not even controversial to say that. Everybody knows it. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop. And watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.